As Mrs. Johnson stepped onto the plane, she felt the weight of 100 eyes judging her, though she didn't know why. What started as a simple flight to visit her son would soon unravel into a journey of humiliation, regret, and a revelation no one on board could have expected. We'd love to know. Comment below where you're tuning in from, and what you think will happen next in Mrs. Johnson's journey. Mrs. Johnson clutched her boarding pass as she stepped onto the plane, her heart fluttering with excitement and nerves. It had been too long since she had seen her son David. He had moved across the country years ago to chase his dreams, and now he was a successful CEO. She was proud of him, so proud it made her chest swell just thinking about it. But today on this flight, something didn't feel right. As Mrs. Johnson walked down the narrow aisle, she could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her. It wasn't obvious at first, just a few curious glances, but soon she noticed it more. Some people stared openly, while others quickly looked away when she caught their gaze. Her fingers tightened around her purse as she fought the uneasy feeling building inside her. Why are they looking at me like that? She wondered. Maybe it was her simple clothes. She wasn't wearing anything fancy, just a modest dress and a shawl. It couldn't be that, could it? Or maybe it was something else. She reached her seat in the first-class section, feeling a little out of place. It wasn't every day she flew in such comfort, but David had insisted on treating her. Nothing but the best for my mom, he had said, and she had smiled proudly. But now, as she settled into the plush seat, she couldn't shake the feeling that she didn't belong. A flight attendant approached, a tall woman with a stiff posture and an air of authority. Mrs. Johnson smiled politely, but the flight attendant didn't return the gesture. Instead, she frowned slightly, her eyes scanning Mrs. Johnson from head to toe, as if something was wrong. "Excuse me," the flight attendant said sharply, her tone as cold as the air blowing from the vents above. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" Mrs. Johnson blinked, startled by the question. She glanced at her boarding pass, then back at the woman. "Yes, I believe so. This is my seat, 3A. The flight attendant raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "First class," she said, her voice dripping with emphasis, as if Mrs. Johnson hadn't heard her correctly the first time. "Are you sure this is where you're supposed to be?" Mrs. Johnson felt her heart sink. She had been so excited about this trip, about seeing her son after all these years, but now, in this moment, she felt small. She opened her mouth to explain, but the words caught in her throat. The woman's eyes were so cold, so judgmental. What had she done wrong? "I have a ticket for this seat," Mrs. Johnson managed to say, her voice quieter than she intended. She handed over the boarding pass, hoping it would settle the matter. The flight attendant looked at the ticket, then thrust it back into Mrs. Johnson's hands. "You must be mistaken," she said loudly, crossing her arms. "You should be sitting in economy, not first class. You don't belong here." The words hit Mrs. Johnson like a punch to the stomach. She could feel her cheeks burning, tears welling up in her eyes. She had never felt so small, so humiliated. She wanted to stand up and shout that she did belong there, that she had every right to sit in that seat. But the words wouldn't come. All she could do was sit there, trapped in her own silence. The flight attendant was waiting, tapping her foot impatiently. "Well," she demanded, "are you going to move or not?" Mrs. Johnson opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. The whispers around her grew louder, filled with judgment and curiosity. She could feel the eyes of the passengers burning into her, each stare like a dagger. How could this be happening? Why was she being treated like this? Finally, the flight attendant sighed again, louder this time. "Fine," she said, throwing up her hands. "Stay where you are. I'll deal with this later." With that, she stormed off, leaving Mrs. Johnson sitting there, humiliated and broken. The whispers continued, and Mrs. Johnson sat staring at the floor, her ticket crumpled in her trembling hands. She held back the tears threatening to spill, her heart heavy with shame. In that moment, she had never felt more out of place in her life. Mrs. Johnson sat in her seat, still trembling from the humiliation of the flight attendant's last encounter. Her heart ached, and the shame hung heavily over her like a dark cloud. She felt powerless, frozen in place by the weight of the judgment around her. She wanted to speak up, to stand her ground, but years of being told to just let it go and don't make a scene kept her voice locked inside. But just as she gathered the courage to finally say something, a crackle came over the intercom. The voice of the captain boomed through the plane, clear and authoritative. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain began, "we have a very special guest flying with us today." Mrs. Johnson glanced around, feeling a flicker of curiosity despite her sadness. The other passengers stirred, sitting up straighter in their seats, clearly eager to know who this important person could be. The whispering stopped, and an expectant hush fell over the cabin. "It is our honor to have with us the CEO of one of the largest and most successful companies in the world, Mr. David Johnson." For a second, Mrs. Johnson wasn't sure if she had heard correctly. David? Her heart skipped a beat. The air in the cabin seemed to shift instantly as gasps and murmurs rippled through the plane. Everyone started looking around, searching for the famous businessman, their eyes wide with excitement. The flight attendant, who had been so cruel to Mrs. Johnson, suddenly sprang to life. Her earlier rudeness forgotten, she straightened her uniform and scanned the cabin eagerly, as though she were on a mission to impress the VIP. She quickly walked up and down the aisles, her eyes darting from passenger to passenger, hoping to locate David Johnson. Mrs. Johnson remained silent, still processing what was happening, but her heart raced with a mixture of disbelief and anticipation. She didn't move, didn't dare say a word as the flight attendant rushed toward her. "Is Mr. David Johnson here?" The attendant asked excitedly, a smile bright and eager now, all traces of her earlier hostility gone. Mrs. Johnson looked up at the woman who had humiliated her only moments before. She felt the weld slow as the flight attendant's gaze fell on her once more. The change in the woman's demeanor was instant. Her eyes widened in shock, her mouth falling open slightly as she made the connection. This woman, the one she had belittled and embarrassed, was the mother of David Johnson, the man the entire plane was now fawning over. "Wait, you're his mother," the flight attendant stammered, her face pale with embarrassment. She took a step back, realizing the gravity of her actions. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted entirely. Passengers who had once glared at Mrs. Johnson with disdain now looked at her with wide-eyed respect, some even with guilt in their eyes. Whispers of "that's his mom" floated through the air. The judgment that had weighed so heavily on Mrs. Johnson just moments ago seemed to vanish, replaced by awe and regret. The flight attendant quickly bent down to Mrs. Johnson's level, her voice shaking as she apologized. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry for the misunderstanding earlier. I didn't know. Please, if there's anything I can do for you." But it was too late. The damage had already been done. Mrs. Johnson looked at the woman, feeling a mix of emotions, sadness, anger, and something close to pity. She had always taught David to treat everyone with kindness, no matter their position or appearance. And now, this very lesson hung over the flight attendant's head. Mrs. Johnson didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The flight attendant, visibly shaken, stumbled backward. Her once confident smile now replaced with regret. The entire cabin watched, the silence speaking louder than words. Mrs. Johnson sat quietly, the chaos around her slowly fading as she regained her composure. The flight attendant stood beside her, fidgeting nervously, waiting for some sort of forgiveness, some acknowledgement that her rushed apology had been accepted. But Mrs. Johnson was in no hurry. She took a deep breath, feeling a sense of calm wash over her. The humiliation she had felt earlier was still fresh, but now it was tempered by something more important, a chance to teach. She turned her eyes to the flight attendant, her gaze soft but firm. "You don't have to keep apologizing," Mrs. Johnson said gently, "but there's something you need to understand." The flight attendant swallowed hard, nodding quickly, eager to make things right. "It shouldn't matter who someone is," Mrs. Johnson continued. Her voice was calm, yet there was a quiet strength in it. "It shouldn't matter if they're rich or poor, famous or unknown. Everyone deserves to be treated with respect. You don't know people's stories, where they come from, or who they are to someone else. The flight attendant's face flushed with shame, and her shoulders drooped as Mrs. Johnson's words settled in. The other passengers, who had once been so quick to judge, now watched in silence, their faces filled with remorse. They too had been part of the problem, feeding into the coldness and judgment, without even realizing it. Mrs. Johnson offered the woman a small, kind smile. "It's not too late to change," she added, "but next time, treat people like they matter, because they do." The flight attendant nodded, eyes filled with regret. "I understand. Thank you, ma'am. I'm truly sorry." When the plane finally landed, Mrs. Johnson gathered her things, feeling lighter. She was ready to see her son David and put this whole experience behind her. As she stepped off the plane, she spotted him waiting at the gate, tall and proud, his eyes lighting up when he saw her. "Mom," David called, rushing forward with open arms. He embraced her tightly, lifting her slightly off the ground in his excitement. Mrs. Johnson laughed, hugging him back just as tightly. "Look at you," David said, stepping back to admire his mother. "I've missed you so much." "I've missed you too," she replied, her heart swelling with love and pride. As she glanced back at the plane, she noticed the flight attendant watching them from a distance, frozen in place. The woman's face was a mixture of fear and regret, knowing now exactly who Mrs. Johnson was, not just a passenger, but the mother of a powerful man. But that wasn't what mattered most to Mrs. Johnson. David followed her gaze, noticing the awkward figure of the flight attendant. "Is everything okay, Mom?" he asked, his voice full of concern. Mrs. Johnson smiled at her son, a knowing smile filled with warmth. "Everything's fine," she said, her voice soft but sure. "I taught someone an important lesson today." David raised an eyebrow, but before he could ask more, she added, "Always remember, son, true respect isn't earned by your title or your money. It's earned by how you treat others." David nodded, his eyes shining with understanding. "You've always taught me that, Mom," he said, squeezing her hand gently, "and I'll never forget it." As they walked away from the gate, hand in hand, Mrs. Johnson felt a deep sense of pride, not just in David's success, but in the values they shared. Today had been hard, but it had also been a reminder that dignity and kindness were far more powerful than wealth or status. Behind them, the flight attendant remained rooted to the spot, a lesson learned in the hardest way possible. The passengers from the plane filed past, each casting glances filled with shame and regret. But Mrs. Johnson didn't need their apologies. She had already found her peace. In the end, it wasn't her son's success that gave her strength, but the knowledge that respect, when given freely to everyone, could change the world one person at a time.